Hello, welcome back to another tutorial. Today we're going to look at inflation from 2023, so paper 91222 2023, and we're just going to walk through each question and think of some structures to answer our questions and some key ideas that the answer script or the markers we're looking for, and hopefully walk through this paper and get a better idea of what we're looking for at the end of your exam. Okay, so question one. Question one, in this paper, and this question comes up in every paper every year, is aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So we need to know what are the components of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. For me, one of my mnemonics maybe to remember the AS model is this copy print, which has COP for cost of production, P for population, I for imported raw materials, PR for productivity, IN for infrastructure, and then T for technology. And the situation here is an increasing costs for the business, so increasing cost of production, and that's due to the increasing wage expectations and the increases in the minimum wage, which is going to shift our AS curve. So we're going to start with the cause, increasing, or from the context, increasing wage expectations and increases in the minimum wage. Component, cost of production, which is the first part of our copy print, so cost of production is increasing. Curve, this causes an increase in AS, or a shift in AS to the left from AS to AS1, so it's going to move back AS to AS1 as cost of production increases and businesses decrease supply in order to maintain profit margins. And then, the consequence spelled wrong there. Consequence, and my consequence is going to be, what is the impact on inflation? So what's the impact on that price level? So I'm going to say this results in cost push inflation as price level increases from PL to PL1. Now on the other side, we're going to talk about demand. So our demand or demand pull inflation is going to be to do with this context, which is in New Zealand in 2022. There was a cost of living payment. It was $350 given to each eligible individual, which was a large percentage of the New Zealand population, and they all got a little bonus income. So let's look at how to answer that. So for me, my cause, when I look at it, I've of course going to look to my AD equation. I'm thinking my cause is going to be an increase in income for the individuals, and this is going to lead to more disposable income for New Zealand households. And they're going to spend that income on a variety of things, of goods and services, which is going to increase C. So my component is going to be an increase in C. Curve, due to the increase in C, AD will rise because C is a component of AD. Put the whole equation in there, C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And then the consequence, this will cause demand pull inflation as price levels increase from PL to PL1. Now the last part of this question, which is where we're looking for those excellence answers, just to clarify or maybe remind ourselves that there's not a clear or as clear of a structure for this excellence part. They might ask us for some questions in some different formats or some different ways, so we can't be too rigid in how we try and learn for this part of the exam. But the question is, discuss whether increasing wage cost or the cost of living payment is likely to have a larger impact on New Zealand's current inflation rate. Refer to graphs 1 and 2 on pages 2 and 3 in your answer. So for me, when I'm looking at this question, I'm going to think about comparing words. So I want to say this one compared to this one, bigger than, smaller than, larger than, so that I can compare those two and say which one's bigger. The second thing I want to do is choose one option. Okay, I'm going to choose one and then lock it in. I'm going to push that answer. I don't want to end this with, I'm not sure which one's bigger. It's asking me which one's bigger. I'm going to make a decision. I'm going to lock that in, and I'm going to go with it all the way. And then on the right-hand side here, I've got some list of some things that might influence my decision. So the size of the shifts, the number of industries affected, the number of regions, the number of people, the number of components affected, and the number, if it's long run or short run, and maybe if there's offsetting curves. Those are all factors that might influence whether there's going to be an increase or whether one's going to be larger than the other. So for us, if we think about our shift in AD, it's a one-time $350 payment, not a huge amount. So I'm going to say that that's going to be relatively small, and it's going to be short run because it's only a one-off. Whereas on the other side, having multiple increases in the minimum wage plus increases in wage expectations, I think it's going to be more of a long run impact. And both are probably affecting lots of industries, both in lots of regions, both lots of people. So I'm not going to reference those. Number of components isn't really applicable here. So I'm going to lock in short run versus long run as my main answer and say wages is more or has a larger impact, to use the words from the question, has a larger impact on New Zealand's current inflation rate because it's a long-term impact. Wages, because of sticky wages typically don't go down. They're going to stay where they are or increase. Whereas the payment for $350, although probably is larger than on a week-to-week increase in the minimum wage, in the long run, it's going to be much smaller, that payment, compared to the increase in minimum wage over a long time. So question 2, quantity theory of money. We know this question also comes up again and again, so we need to just kind of rote learn those key components, which is remembering the definitions of inflation, remembering the definitions of MV equals PQ and that equation. And that's how we're going to tackle this question here today. So to start with consequences of high inflation, there's a number of reasons that you can write into this. Consequences, you might say uncertainty for the future, so consumer confidence and business confidence might be off. You might say it might lead to income inequality, as high income earners are better off. You might say it's going to lead to a price wage spiral. Any of those options that you've looked at in class can be good for this consequences of inflation. And then for MV equals PQ, you just have to know this. You just have to have it locked in. And when you go into the exam, money supply, velocity of circulation, price level, real output. The key here probably is to remember real output, or where I see lots of people go wrong is they just say velocity. They don't say velocity of circulation. So get the full name in there. And then C, just down the bottom there, using the quantity theory of money, explain how 2% decrease in the money supply would impact the inflation rate in New Zealand. And then, sorry, I've got this section on the right. I wonder if I can move my talking head now. Proportionate is the word that we want to use in part C. So we want to state all of the components, M, V, P, and Q. And then we want to start with the ones we assume are the same. So we're going to say, if we assume that V stays the same, if we assume that Q stays the same, what's going to be the impact on price level of a change in money supply? So assuming V stays the same, assuming Q stays the same, assuming MV equals PQ is a truism, then an increase in 2% on the money supply is going to result in a proportionate increase in the price level of 2%. So the final step is to talk about price level. So for this excellence question, or this last question in question 2, it's actually not too tricky. All we're going to do is kind of compare those two situations, but still using our same structure. So that's kind that we get to do that here, which is to say, when there's a change in the money supply, then, or when velocity of circulation and real output are the same, so state our assumptions are the same, then when the money supply changes, the price level changes. We've already stated that right there. Now when we're adding in another situation, which is during a recession, so output is decreased, then we get to do this balancing part where we say, if money supply goes up by 2%, velocity stays the same, or perhaps even, velocity stays the same, but output decreases overall, then you can say that we're going to end up by maybe a price level increase of 1%, so that equation stays balanced. The key here probably is for you guys to write down in your answer, or before you answer the equation, and literally put the numbers on each side of the equation so that you can make sure that you've got the increases and decreases correct, so that you get to that 1% number at the end. So yeah, just to clarify, step 1, step through the first situation, the first bullet point. With the bullet points, you got your assumptions, then tell me what's changing, then tell me impact on price level. Then for the second bullet point, same thing. What are your assumptions? What's changing? What's the impact on price level there? Remember, it says compare and contrast, so you want to use those words. However, on the other hand, compared to, larger than, just so that you can tell the marker that you're comparing these two, not just listing facts. Okay, so explain how, question 3, explain how inflation is measured in New Zealand. And then B, explain why New Zealand is likely to experience disinflation rather than deflation as the Reserve Bank takes pressures to control the inflation rate. There's a few definitions that we just need to lock in for this exam, and one of them, or a bunch of them, are going to be to do with this measurement of inflation, talking about basket of goods, talking about weighted index, talking about consumer price index, talking about necessities versus luxuries, but explaining how how inflation is measured is going to be ticking a lot of those boxes. We've only got 4 lines there, so there's not too much depth required, but you do definitely want to be defining CPI. It's a weighted basket of goods that are purchased by New Zealand households, and they're used to measure changes in the general price level. You want to be saying all of those things. And then B I actually find a bit tricky. You definitely need to know the current situation, which is going to be that increase in inflation over the last few years, and which obviously we've said in the previous questions. And then we can say we're at high inflation. Why are we going to get to disinflation rather than deflation? Well, that's because inflation isn't a quick thing to change. Right? It takes a bit of time to change. So we've been going up. Rather than going into the negatives. We're probably just going to decrease to get that disinflation as we try and work towards that RBNZ remit of between 1% and 3% inflation. It's unlikely that we're going to get to negative inflation or deflation because it's actually really far away. 7.2% or 7% is really far away from that 0%. And if we did start to approach it, RBNZ would start to change their policies in order to keep us above that deflation, which is probably the darker side of their remit. They don't want to enter that deflation stage. And then our last page, it was announced in February that the minimum wage would increase to X amount. This is an increase of 7.1% and aligns with the 7.2% inflation rate to ensure workers do not lose purchasing power as a result of increasing levels of inflation. The labour cost index is one measure of the increases in wages across the entire economy and shows that salaries only rose 3.7% in 2022. We're going to try and use the resource material above to explain changes in the real wage for workers earning the minimum wage compared to other workers in the economy, and then compare and contrast the high inflation on low-income and high-income households. So for the first part, for part C, we're going to say real wage versus nominal wage. So the real wage in this situation, for the minimum wage worker, it stayed relatively similar. They can purchase the same amount of goods and services, whereas the salaried worker, while their wage might have increased by 3.7%, they've actually experienced a negative wage increase in terms of their real wages. They can now purchase less goods and services than they could before. So comparing here, use comparing words, and we're really trying to say that those guys who are on a salary are now worse off compared to the people on a minimum wage who are the same. And then for D, when we're comparing the high inflation impact of high inflation on low income versus high income households, the results or the impact is going to be actually pretty different. So for low income households, typical low income households are going to be people on unemployment benefit or pensions, and people with fixed income, maybe fixed contract, maybe wage or low skilled employment. Those guys. They're going to have pretty fixed income, and they're not going to be able to change or negotiate their income. For example, a pensioner can't negotiate their pension with the government. And then as inflation rises, they're now forced to spend a higher percentage of their income on necessities, and then have to start to give up essential goods and services. Whereas high income households, even when inflation rises, they've got a larger buffer of luxuries that they can work into. They can give up some luxuries before giving up those necessities. And they're usually higher skilled. They're usually able to negotiate pay, usually on individual contracts. And then lastly, they're more likely to own more property or assets or things that are going to, or businesses, things that are going to increase in value with that increase in inflation, so that they're better off.